For the better half of a year, this was my only lens and camera that I used as a videographer. But on top of that, I relied on this combo as my only source of income. But first off, why this setup specifically? Well, honestly, it wasn't chosen out of luxury, but it was actually out of necessity. You see, I was laid off at the beginning of 2023, and without a source of income, I couldn't afford to buy new gear. But I did have enough gear to start landing gigs through referrals and networking. And the camera I happened to have was the Sigma FP, the smallest full-frame cinema camera that came out in 2020 and is really unmatched in many ways to this day. I also have the EVF with it, which has a unique rotating design that really helped with manual focus lenses. And the camera puts out great footage. It is 4K 12-bit cinema DNG RAW files, but really it is the only one that does it at such a low price point. However, as a freelance videographer, this is probably one of the worst camera setups I could have had at the time. The lens that I had at the time and I'm still using today is the Tokina 28-70 2.8 ATX Pro 2, which is related to the Angénieux cinema lens maker. And I know what you're thinking, usually these one lens exercises usually have only a single focal length, and while I really love the idea of doing that, this just wasn't planned, as I mentioned before. But the lens is from the 1990s and it's a Nikon F mount. I really come to love the look of this lens because it has really beautiful rendering and it has this nice soft glow when wide open that really cuts down on digital sensors. But of course, I had purchased it strictly for creative work and for more methodical shooting where you have time to sit down and stage everything. Because it is a heavy lens with no autofocus, limited to 28mm on the wide side, and it's a little too soft to use at f2.8 from 50 to 70mm. It also has a few other issues that I found out the hard way. So needless to say, I wasn't very well prepared for the type of run and gun video work that I started doing. We're talking weddings, corporate events, interviews, and even real estate in glorious 4K 12-bit cinema DNG RAW files. Despite how much of a pain it was to use this combo, I really wouldn't change a thing if I could go back in time. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll kind of understand my reasoning behind that. Or at least I'll be able to justify to myself why I put up with it for so long. So at the time I had done a few music videos with the FP, but I had never done really run and gun work with it. And one of the first gigs that I got after I got laid off was a wedding as a second shooter. This is where I immediately ran into problems with the lack of in-body image stabilization. First of all, this camera with its cage, the EVF, the SSD holder, and the SSD, the whole thing weighs just shy of 4 pounds. So you would think that would be good for cutting out the micro jitters, but after you're holding that to your face for 10 hours a day at a wedding, you get pretty cooked. The first one was 90 degrees and I'm sitting out there in Vallejo. The sun's beating down on and I'm trying to pull focus with this 4-pound brick stuck to my face. And even the smallest movement showed up in the footage. So I very quickly learned to use tripods, lean heavily on using my shoulder strap as a brace, as a third point of contact, and I even got a little creative with it using these small mini Manfrotto tripods as chest braces. The funny thing is, after the third wedding, I pretty much had enough experience to confidently handhold at 70mm and get no micro jitters. And I even got decent at the Ninja Walk at 28mm when there wasn't enough time to set up a gimbal. So as you can see, I started gaining skills because the equipment wasn't holding my hand along the way. But then there was the issue of storage. Cinema DNG RAW files eat up a ton of space. I'm talking like 16 gigabytes per minute of footage. And most of my projects were sit-down interviews or real estate shoots that had very high shooting ratios, meaning that I would go through the footage super fast. Early on, I only had one single SSD, and that gave me just about an hour and a half of recording time. So I had to be incredibly precise with my shot list and really learned quickly how to direct the talent efficiently so that I could minimize the takes. There were a few moments of near panic where I was close to running out of space, and I basically had to improvise and cut the quality of the footage down a little bit. But what it did is it taught me to work smarter and focus on what I actually was looking to get out of a certain project. The next issue I encountered was trying to share the RAW files with editors, and that entire post-production workflow, if they're not used to it, can be a complete nightmare. This is a world we're talking about where Sony and Canon 10-bit workflows are the norm, and Cinema DNG is just incredibly difficult to work with. My workflow basically consisted of importing the files to my computer, transferring it to a program called SlimRaw, and compressing it in a post-production workflow. So instead of the compression that you usually find in camera, I had to do it post-production on my computer, which was workable, but it definitely slowed down the entire process. But I was able to get it to a lossless 3:1 ratio, which is similar to what the Red Komodo has, for instance. But this lens itself had quirks. The tiny focus throw was the bane of my existence. Honestly, it made it so hard to nail focus precisely, and I found myself missing some shots because I just couldn't precisely focus in time. However, one thing I didn't have to worry about is matching the colors across multiple lenses. Since I shot with the same lens for everything looked very consistent throughout. There were actually a few pros to using one single lens. For one, the range was actually perfect. 28mm to 70mm is really usable for basically everything. I really didn't miss having the 24 wide-angle lens, and I think 28mm is really where a lot of the distortion starts happening when you're filming someone up close. So in that sense, I think it's probably what I would prefer. Honestly, if I would have my choice, I would probably get a 28 to 85 or 90 focus range on a zoom. Another thing I noticed is that when using a zoom lens, at least for me, I tend to go from one extreme to another. So say you're on a 24 to 70, probably greater than half of my footage is going to be on one of those sides of the extreme. So in that sense, I really did want to get a lot of experience at the 28mm focal length, and this worked out for that. Being honest, I didn't only use this single lens for that whole year. In fact, there were a few times where I had to use a wide-angle lens for a real estate shoot. And instead of just going out and buying one, since I was pretty cash-strapped, I rented one instead. And that was a great solution that I just baked directly into the costs of the quotation to the client. I like the idea of renting a piece of equipment until you rent it 3 times and you can see that there's a progression to where you would be using it enough to justify actually purchasing it. So in that sense, rentals filled the gap between what I had and what I needed for certain jobs, and allowed me to just be able to do jobs that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise if I didn't have the gear up front. The cDNG raw files did save me a few times in post-production as well, so it wasn't all terrible. For instance, if I didn't get the white balance correct, or if I completely underexposed, I could save it. So in the end, I learned some pretty good lessons that year. I would say the biggest surprise was actually how little I thought about the fact that I only had one camera and lens. It's funny because now that I've accumulated way too much gear, I think about it way too often when I'm trying to prep for a gig coming up. But 2 years ago, all I had to think about was what was in front of the camera. And the thing was that the clients didn't even care what gear I showed up with. They only cared about the final deliverable. So in that sense, I think really less gear does mean less distractions and a more focused, cohesive vision. And now fast forward 2 years and my gear collection has grown almost to an excessive degree. Now I'm trying to get back to that very simple, efficient, streamlined setup that I started out with when I couldn't even afford anything else. In my opinion, I think that having just one lens, one camera, or a similar type of very streamlined setup doesn't actually make you more creative. I think that's kind of a misconception that I hear a lot, but what I really think that it does is makes you much more efficient. And once you're efficient, you basically are allowed the freedom to become creative, but really that creativity is driven from yourself, not from, how much or how little gear you have. Like, it's really, I think it's kind of funny when people say that, but in my opinion at least, it lets you just completely remove the tool that you're using and just be able to focus on the craft instead of, being bogged down by all of your gear and all these other decisions. Like, there's already infinite decisions to make when you're on a gig or a shoot or anything. And so removing some of those off the front is actually beneficial to just streamlining the whole thing. and allowing you to be creative. So I guess maybe it does make sense. Like, people say that a ton, and yeah, maybe they're right. But the way I look at it is it's just removing something that gives you way more choices than you really need. So it makes you more efficient in that sense. The final takeaway I had from this is that the gear that you know is better than top-end gear. The gear you're intimately familiar with is always going to serve you better than picking up a brand new camera just because you think it'll give you better footage. Working within the limitations of whatever you have at the moment actually can help you develop these kind of skills, in the sense where I wasn't being handheld by stuff like autofocus or IBIS, or even, easy to work with codec. All those things kind of forced me to improve my skills at handheld footage, improve my color grading using the cDNG raw files, and basically pick up the slack that I might not have gotten if I had started with a more capable camera. I may have kind of never gained those lessons and learned the hard way, or it would have taken me longer to learn if I was using something that just did everything for me. But if you're interested in the eventual rig that I ended up with, that I use on all 3 of my cameras now, check out this rig that you can actually hot swap the camera out of.